Hello all. So another week, and this time we're going to look at banded iron formations mostly, and also manganophorous deposits. So these are related to sedimentary style ore deposit models, which occur in very specific time frames in Earth's history, generally, especially for banded iron formations. So they are classed as chemical sediments. Because we have some precipitation of iron, predominantly iron, out of water columns in sort of shallow environments, but we also get this fine banding of the iron-rich and usually chert or silica-rich horizons, hence the name banded iron formations. And these are the most important sources of iron worldwide, and like I said, they predominantly formed in the Precambrian. Most have formed before the Great Oxidation Event because we can maintain fairly reduced iron at the surface. And then we have a process that needs to oxidize that to precipitate it out of water. But there is a few different types. They've been classified according to age, tectonic setting, and the dominant ore mineralogy. But the BIFs that define the Hamersley Range are probably the most common. So the main types, we have Algoma, Superior, and Rapaterian. So Superior would be like our Hamersley Ranges, they're most common fended forms of BIF. Algoma are very old and predominantly related to black smokers or greenstone belts. And Rapaterian, we have a few examples in South Australia where we have an association with snowball earth to create these reduced environments. Generally, these banded iron formations are not currently forming, and they're predominantly greater than the Precambrian. So before life has actually inhibited many of these deposits from forming regularly. So we'll briefly go through these main types of deposits. So the Algoma type banded iron formations, they're fairly small and narrow in strike, and they're closely associated with volcanic rocks and grey wackies. So common in the greenstone belts of cratonic material. Many of them are very ancient. The oldest is one in Greenland. Some people think is 3.5 billion years old. And it's inferred that the iron is coming from deep sea vents. So we talked about black smokers early in trimester. We have a similar process where we can actually introduce iron into the water column, and then it can precipitate out as Fe3 plus if we can subtly change, if we can induce an oxidation of that iron. So, and we'll look at what controlling that oxidation in a bit. So they're much smaller than superior type BIFs, but they are a clear subclass. So superior type, this is the most common. They're thick and most regionally extensive. They're generally deposited on stable continental shelves in broad marine basins. Most are in Proterozoic ages, and generally this is dispersed by the Great Oxidation Event at 2.2 billion years old. And this includes the most excellent deposits in the Hamersley, like Mount Whaleback, and also in South Australian like Iron Duke. So this is currently the most economically important deposits of iron in the world, but that has changed over time. During the Industrial Revolution, they were modern iron bog style deposits, but at the moment, banded iron formations are the best style. So the key here is there's no simultaneous volcanic activity with these deposits. They are chemical sedimentation. We need to introduce iron into the water, and then we go through a process where it dissolves out to form magnetite. So there's a few controversies, but in essence we have this beautiful delicate layering. The two main components are iron and silica, and they're derived from ocean water. The prevailing theory is that they're not to do with continental material because we don't have things like aluminium, which is rich in the continents, in the iron-rich sediments. People think that the iron may have got into the water column through mantle plume activity and large oceanic plateau basalts. They can introduce iron into the water column. So others think that maybe the iron is coming from black smoke vents, but further away from these systems. So what happens is we have ferrous or reduced iron, so Fe2+, and the deep oceanic environment is introduced to the shallow continental shelf, and it intersects a portion of the water at shallow levels that oxidizes the iron. It undergoes hydrolysis, and we can form ferric hydroxide, so it dissolves out of the water column. So what controls that oxidizing is very important. So here is a broad perception of a banded iron system. So we have reduced iron down here, and we have a zone where we are oxidizing it. People think that this could be associated with ultraviolet radiation to induce photooxidation. It could also be related to bacteria or cyanobacteria producing small amounts of oxygen into certain portions of the water column, that when the iron comes up, it can actually transform or oxidize to Fe3+ and deposit as iron hydroxides. This could be hematite and magnetite. And the silica also has to dissolve out, and that can be slightly problematic, but people think without things like radiolera in the ancient earth, that the silica, it reaches a saturation point and deposited between the iron-rich layers. But because we have this rhythmic repeating sequence of layers, there must be a degree of seasonality or longer-term variability in these processes that in part controls when we're getting iron precipitation versus silica. So that's where people think that maybe ultraviolet radiation is more important, or that's controlling the output from bacteria in the water column. So that's the main ways these systems work. We can also get influence from other carbonate material. You can get siderite, but some people also think that there was a degree of secondary enrichment that must go on. So this is a style of banded iron formation, the classic one. So we know that there has to be a link between age, atmosphere, and ocean biology to control the precipitation of these styles of deposits. So the main mineralogy becomes dominated by magnetite initially, but then we also end up with hematite and gorthite, and we can get the chert layers, and they can also have carbonates like iron carbonate, siderite, and in many cases extensive evidence for replacement of one mineral by another. So the perception is that the magnetite transforms to hematite, typically during either a supergene or hypergene process where we have a second degree of oxidation or exposure to fluids of the banded iron, and sometimes that can generate carbonate material from the chert. But this secondary enrichment process is very important because most banded iron formations initially only have about 30% iron, which is uneconomical. But through these secondary enrichment or processes, we can actually enrich that iron to over 60%, making it much better for economic grades. And in the case of Western Australia, these have been metamorphosed to low degrees and reinforced the fabric and strength of the systems. So a very similar deposit is manganese deposits. They can form in similar settings. Generally, they don't occur together, but sometimes they do, like in South Africa. But most manganese exists as manganese 2 plus and is insoluble as manganese 3 plus and manganese 4 plus. So we have a degree of oxidation, again, in the water column that precipitates manganese out, and commonly this forms as pyrolusite, so manganese oxide. So both are very similar, and we have a control of redox and also pH. So, but a classic example is Groot Eland in Northern Territory for a prominent manganese deposit. So here's a simple diagram where we have pH again versus oxidation potential. So for iron, here's 2 plus to 3 plus. If we increase pH, we can also form hematite here, and at very reduced systems, we can have magnetite. So if we oxidize, we can get hematite. And for manganese, here's manganese 2 plus. If we go to increasing pH, we can get rhodochrosite, manganese carbonate, and if we oxidize, we can form pyrolusite, manganese oxide. And so we have different stability limits based on their solubility in water. Usually the reduced material is more soluble in water, and as you oxidize, we get to a position where it actually precipitates out as maybe hematite or pyrolusite, depending on banded iron formations or manganese deposits. So that's all I have for this one. Very simple. Keeps it nice and quick and easy for you all.